The 1980s never ended. Yeah, the haircuts deflated, computer graphics got less pixelated, but the sound, the style, and the spirit of the 80s mutated and became part of pop culture's DNA. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, they came back roaring in new, unexpected ways. This was more than mere nostalgia, but a kind of reinvention that defies time. From indie electronica to the shiny Y2K aesthetic, the 80s became a fantasy version of themselves, louder, glossier, and stranger than ever before. Every 20 years, pop culture loops back on itself. The 90s had disco house and 70s revival. Naturally, the 2000s rediscovered the 80s, and now we're rediscovering the 2000s. But the 80s sounds never really disappeared. Drum machines like the Roland TR-808, gated reverbs and glossy scenes became part of the permanent toolkit for producers. By the late 90s, artists like MF Doom were sampling TC-80s ballads ironically, laying the groundwork for what would become Vaporwave a decade later. Meanwhile, video games like GTA Vice City made the neon-soaked Miami fantasy world mainstream again. The 2000s didn't just remember the 80s, they reimagined them as myth, a dreamlike past of fast cars, VHS tapes, and neon city skyline. A version of the 80s that maybe never really existed, but we wanted to believe in anyway. The most exciting 80s revival happening in the late 90s and early 2000s wasn't on the pop charts, but in the indie electronica and dream pop. In 2001, Daft Punk's Discovery changed everything. With its vocoder vocals, lush synths, and disco house grooves, it reframed the 80s for a digital generation and built the bridge between French touch house and the neon revival to come. The revival included a certain type of ethereal female voices. Cyndi Lauper was the blueprint. Donna Lewis took the baton and handed it to the likes of 07 and Air. Then came a wave of artists from Scandinavia who took the 80s palette and made it cinematic, emotional, and futuristic. Röyksopp and The Knife delivered lush, dreamy soundscapes that pushed dream pop into darker, surreal territory, while Robyn reinvented herself as a futuristic synth-pop icon. Goldfrapp mixed glam rock and synth-pop into shimmering electro-fantasies, while Empire of the Sun built widescreen euphoric synth-pop that felt like pure 80s fantasy. The underground burned bright too. College created The Haunting a Real Hero, later immortalized in the film Drive, and set the blueprint for the Synthwave ballad. Electroclash like Fisher Spooner, Ladytron and Peaches added punk edge. Blockhouse spread through MySpace and MP3 blogs, with Justice, Mastercrafter and Digitalism turning dance floors into pixelated chaos. All of it was connected, from Lauper's heartfelt 80s ballads through 90s trip hop into the full spectrum of indie electronica that defined the 80s revival. They were remixing them into new hybrids that were pure, forward-looking nostalgia. At the turn of the millennium, the 80s fused with something new, the Y2 aesthetic. Metallics, chrome, bubble fonts and sparkles. Neon UI screens that look straight out of the Matrix or Windows XP. It was retrofuturism filtered through the early internet culture. But alongside that shine came an obsession with imperfections of the 80s tech. VHS static, pixelation, glitch art, cassette hiss. This became their own aesthetic, birthed in vaporwave and glitch music. As critic Simon Reynolds puts it, we were living in an era of Retromania, addicted to remixing the past rather than starting from scratch. The 80s become less of a decade and more of a mythical land, a collective fantasy of neon skylines, cyborgs, and endless highways. By the 2010s, we got movies like Drive, where Kavinsky's Night Call set the tone for a whole neo-noir aesthetic and the birth of synthwave. The 80s were everywhere, in indie clubs, in video games, in movie soundtracks. And what we were really nostalgic for was the idea of the 80s. So, have the last 20 years been just obsessed with the past? Or we had no choice but create something new by remixing it again and again? At the very edge of the millennium, one film seemed to capture it all, The Matrix. In truth, it recycled the 1980s vision of the future. Neon-drenched skylines, chrome, leather coat, and digital paranoia straight out of Blade Runner, New Romancer, and Tron. Seen today, The Matrix feels like the peak of late 90s Western confidence, and the moment when we admitted that our future was stuck in a loop. We weren't imagining new tomorrows, we were condemned to recycle the futures that the 80s had already dreamed up. And maybe that's the point. The 80s never really died. They live on in every remix, every synth, every neon light. Each revival makes them into something that they never truly were, the simulacra and simulation we're still walking through.